Have you ever sat in a classroom, half listening to a lesson and wondered why this is even the shape learning takes? Rows of desks, a person standing at the front, a bell deciding when your brain is allowed to think about something else. Not whether school is useful, not whether you liked it or hated it, but how an entire civilization agreed thousands of years ago that children should be gathered into rooms and taught things by someone who was not their parent. The truth is, school was not invented in a single moment by a single genius. Nobody drew up a blueprint and declared, "This is how humans will learn from now on." It clawed its way into existence slowly, unevenly, and sometimes brutally, through temples, empires, monasteries, and arguments about what a mind is even for. So the real question is not who invented school. The better question is, what problem were humans always going to solve this way? Let's start in ancient Mesopotamia, more than 4,000 years ago. The Sumerians had just invented writing, a system of wedge-shaped marks pressed into wet clay called cuneiform. And writing turned out to be a problem all on its own. It was complicated. It took years to learn. So the Sumerians built something new, a place called the Aduba, which literally meant tablet house. Boys, almost always boys, sat for hours copying lists of words, prices, and laws onto clay tablets under the eye of a strict instructor. There was no debate about creativity or self-expression. There was repetition, correction, and punishment for getting it wrong. School, in its very first form, was not built to inspire anyone. It was built to produce scribes, the accountants and record-keepers an empire needed to function. Learning was not a gift. It was a job requirement.
Now, travel to ancient Egypt, where a similar need produced a similar solution. Temple schools trained boys destined to become scribes, priests, or officials, drilling them in hieroglyphics, mathematics, and religious texts. Discipline was severe. One surviving Egyptian text bluntly states that a boy's ear is on his back, meaning he listens when he is beaten. Harsh as that sounds today, it reflects something important. Early schooling was never really about childhood the way we think of it now. It was about turning a small number of children into the specialists a growing civilization could not survive without. Meanwhile, in ancient China, a very different philosophy was taking shape. Around the 6th century BCE, a thinker named Confucius argued that education should not just train officials, it should build moral character. He believed anyone with the right discipline, not just the wealthy, deserved the chance to learn. His ideas eventually shaped the imperial examination system, an extraordinarily difficult set of tests that determined who could become a government official. Peasant families would sometimes pool their resources for years, hoping one gifted son could pass the exams and lift the entire family's fortunes. For the first time in this story, school was not just about producing workers for the state. It was becoming a ladder, a way to climb out of the life you were born into, at least in theory. In ancient Greece, education took yet another turn. In Athens, teachers called grammatists taught boys reading, writing, and arithmetic, while other instructors focused on music, poetry, and athletics, believing a healthy mind needed a healthy body attached to it. Philosophers like Plato pushed this further, founding the Academy, a school dedicated not to memorization, but to questioning, debating, and reasoning through difficult ideas. For Plato, the goal was not simply to fill a student with facts, it was to train them how to think at all. That single shift, from copying information to interrogating it, planted a seed that would echo through every classroom that followed, right up to today.
The Romans borrowed heavily from Greek education, but bent it towards practicality, training boys in rhetoric and public speaking because Roman society ran on the ability to argue persuasively in courts, the Senate, and the marketplace. But as the Roman Empire crumbled, formal education crumbled with it across much of Europe. For centuries, organized schooling nearly vanished outside of one place, the church. Monasteries became the last strongholds on literacy in the early medieval world, with monks preserving ancient texts and teaching a small number of students to read Latin, copy manuscripts, and study scripture. Without monks hunched over candlelit desks for generations, an enormous amount of ancient knowledge might have simply disappeared. By the medieval period, cathedral schools and eventually universities began appearing across Europe in cities like Bologna, Paris, and Oxford. These early universities were rowdy, chaotic places, closer to guilds than modern campuses, where students paid individual teachers directly and could riot if they felt cheated. Still, something important was happening. Education was slowly separating from the church's total control, becoming its own institution, with its own degrees, its own hierarchies, and its own reputation to protect. For centuries after that, though, school remained something only a small slice of society ever touched. Wealthy boys received tutors or attended private academies. Girls were, in most places, denied formal education almost entirely, expected to learn domestic skills at home instead. Peasant children worked the fields their entire lives, with no path toward a classroom at all. Literacy was rare, expensive, and treated less like a right and more like a privilege reserved for the few who could afford it, or the fewer still who were born into it. Then, in the 1500s and 1600s, the printing press changed everything. Books, once costly and painstakingly hand-copied, became dramatically cheaper and far more widespread. Suddenly, literacy was not just useful for a handful of scribes and clergy, it was becoming useful for merchants, tradesmen, and eventually entire towns. Protestant reformers, believing individuals should read scripture themselves rather than rely solely on priests, pushed hard for wider literacy, and some regions, particularly in parts of Germany and Scotland, began experimenting with something radical: schools open to ordinary children, not just the elite.
The real turning point came in the 1800s, during the Industrial Revolution. Factories needed workers who could follow written instructions, read basic contracts, and handle simple arithmetic. Cities were swelling with children who no longer worked family farms, but instead filled crowded, often dangerous urban streets. Reformers in countries like Prussia and later the United States and Britain began pushing for something new: mandatory, state-funded education for all children, not just the wealthy. Prussia, in particular, built an influential model, dividing students by age into grades, standardizing curriculum, and training professional teachers, a structure so effective that other nations began copying it almost exactly. That Prussian blueprint, arranged by age rather than ability, moving through subjects on a fixed schedule, is startlingly close to the classroom you probably sat in yourself. By the late 1800s and early 1900s, compulsory education laws spread rapidly across Europe and North America. For the first time in human history, entire generations of children, regardless of family wealth, were legally required to sit in a classroom for years of their lives. It was not designed for creativity or curiosity first. It was designed, much like that Sumerian tablet house 4,000 years earlier, to produce something society urgently needed. In this case, a literate, disciplined workforce for a rapidly industrializing world. And yet, layered on top of that original purpose were centuries of older ideas: Confucius's belief in moral cultivation, Plato's belief in questioning, the monk's belief in preserving knowledge itself, all quietly baked into the same institution. Here's the strange part: no single person invented school. No blueprint exists that started it all. No founder, no ribbon cutting, no single eureka moment. It was built by empires needing scribes, philosophers needing better thinkers, monks needing to preserve the past, reformers needing literate citizens, and factories needing disciplined workers. It evolved the way cities evolve, the way languages evolve, shaped by thousands of decisions across thousands of years, each one adding a room, a rule, a reason, without anyone fully seeing the final shape. Maybe that is the real story behind school. It was never really about the desks or the bell or the chalkboard. It was about humans needing a way to pass down everything they had learned before they ran out of time to teach it themselves. And maybe that is exactly why it never stopped growing.